This image seemed cheerful, until historians noticed a hidden secret. Dr. Marcus Hayes adjusted his reading glasses and leaned closer to the photograph spread across his desk at the National Archives in Washington. The image had arrived 2 weeks earlier from an estate sale in Yazoo City, Mississippi, tucked inside a cracked leather suitcase that had belonged to a woman named Ruth Coleman, who had passed away at 98 years old. The photograph showed a black family standing proudly in front of a modest wooden house. 5 people, a tall man in his 30s wearing a pressed Sunday suit, his wife beside him in a white dress with delicate embroidery, and 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, dressed in their finest clothes. Behind them stretched acres of cotton fields, and to the right, a hand-painted sign read, Johnson Family Farm, Esther 1926. What struck Marcus immediately was the contrast in their expressions. Pride radiated from every face, yet something else lingered beneath. A tightness around the eyes, a forced quality to their smiles. The father's hand rested protectively on his oldest son's shoulder. The mother's fingers clutched a small leather Bible. April 1927, Marcus murmured, reading the faded pencil notation on the back of the photograph. His pulse quickened. That date placed the image just weeks before the Great Mississippi Flood, the most destructive river flood in American history. But something else made his hands tremble slightly as he held the photograph. Mississippi in 1927 was one of the most dangerous places in America for black families who owned land. The Jim Crow South had perfected systems of terror designed to strip African Americans of property, dignity, and hope. For a black family to purchase and maintain farmland in that time and place required not just money, but extraordinary courage. Marcus had spent 15 years researching black land ownership during this period, and he knew the statistics by heart. Between 1910 and 1930, African Americans lost nearly half of their land holdings across the South through violence, legal manipulation, fraudulent tax sales, and outright theft. In Mississippi, the losses were even more devastating. Yet here was this family standing on their own land, documented and proud. He picked up his magnifying glass and began examining the photograph more carefully, working systematically from left to right. The father appeared to be in his mid-30s, with strong features and calloused hands visible even in the photograph. The mother looked younger, perhaps late 20s, with an elegant bearing despite the simple dress. Then Marcus noticed something that made him pause. The front door of the house stood slightly ajar behind the family, and through that opening he could see a portion of the interior wall. At first, he thought it was just shadow and texture from the old wood, but as he increased the magnification and adjusted the angle of his lamp, letters began to emerge from the darkness, writing, on the wall. His historian's instinct flared. That electric sensation when something ordinary suddenly reveals itself as extraordinary. Marcus spent the entire night digitally enhancing the photograph, isolating the section visible through the doorway and working to reveal every mark on that interior wall. By dawn, his eyes burned from staring at the screen, but he had extracted enough text to understand he was looking at something far more significant than a simple family portrait. The writing appeared to have been done in pencil and ink in at least 3 different hands. Some entries were neat and careful, others hurried and desperate. He could make out partial dates, March 12th, March 28th, April 2nd. Names appeared repeatedly, Coleman, Sheriff Briggs, Mr. Henderson, and phrases that made his chest tighten. 3 men on horses, letter from county, they came back. Each line represented an entry, a record of something that had happened. The Johnson family had been documenting events systematically, creating a timeline of incidents on their own wall. Marcus's hands trembled as he typed out what he could decipher, creating a spreadsheet of dates and descriptions. March 12th. Henderson at gate, said last chance. March 15th. Dog poisoned, found near well. March 20th. Riders tonight, 3 men, stayed at road. March 28th. Letter from county, taxes questioned. April 2nd. Fire in Southfield. Coleman helped put out. April 5. Sheriff came, warned us. The entries stopped on April 10th, just days before the photograph was dated, April 1927. Either the family had stopped writing, or the photograph captured the last moment before something happened that made documentation impossible. Marcus reached for his phone and dialed Professor James Williams at the University of Mississippi. It was barely 6 in the morning, but this couldn't wait. James answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep. Marcus, what's wrong? I need you in Washington today, Marcus said, his voice tight. I found something. A photograph from Yazoo County, April 1927. There's writing on a wall in the background, a threat log. James, I think this family was documenting a campaign of terror against them, and I think we're looking at evidence that's been hidden for 97 years. There was silence on the line, then James's voice came back sharp and awake. Send me the images. I'm getting dressed now. I'll be there by noon. Marcus sent the files and then sat back in his chair, staring at the 5 faces in the photograph. The father, mother, and 3 children who had stood on their land and smiled for the camera while behind them, hidden in the shadows of their home, their wall told a different story entirely. What had happened to them after this photograph was taken? And why had someone, Ruth Coleman, kept this image hidden in a Bible for nearly a century, waiting for someone to finally see what was written in the darkness behind that joyful pose? Professor James Williams arrived at the National Archives just after noon, his worn leather briefcase in hand and exhaustion evident in his face from the 4-hour drive from Oxford. Marcus met him at the security desk and led him directly to the conservation room where the original photograph lay protected under archival tissue. James bent over the image with his magnifying glass, studying it in complete silence for several minutes. His breathing grew heavier as he examined the barely visible writing through the doorway. Finally, he straightened and removed his glasses, pressing his fingers against his eyes. "Do you know what you found?" James asked quietly. "Tell me I'm not imagining it," Marcus replied. "You're not." James pointed to the visible portion of the wall. "That's a threat log. Some families kept them, documenting every incident, every intimidation attempt, every act of violence. It was the only way to establish a pattern if they ever had a chance to seek legal protection, though that chance was nearly non-existent in Mississippi." Marcus pulled up his enhanced images on the computer screen. The dates run from mid-March through early April 1927. Almost daily entries. This wasn't random intimidation, James. This was systematic. James studied the timeline Marcus had created, his jaw tightening as he read each entry. Spring of 1927. Do you know what else was happening in Mississippi that April? The Great Flood, Marcus said. It peaked in mid-April. More than that. James pulled out his tablet and accessed his research files. In the months before the flood, there was a coordinated campaign across the Delta. White planters wanted to consolidate land holdings before the disaster hit, knowing they could profit from reconstruction contracts afterward. Black landowners who refused to sell faced night riders, burned crops, threats. Most gave in or fled. Marcus felt pieces clicking into place. So families like the Johnsons would have been under enormous pressure to sell. "Ooh, enormous doesn't begin to cover it," James said grimly. He walked back to the photograph, studying the faces again. But if they were driven off or killed, how did this photograph survive? Why would Ruth Coleman have it? That's what I've been trying to figure out. Marcus turned to his computer and pulled up census records. I searched for the Johnson family in the 1930 census. There's no Johnson family farm listed in Yazoo County after 1927. In fact, there's no Johnson family at all in the county records after April of that year. They disappeared, James said. Or were disappeared, Marcus corrected. But Coleman, that name appears multiple times in the threat log. Coleman helped put out the fire in their field. I think Coleman was family or a close neighbor who tried to help them. Marcus pulled up genealogical records he had accessed that morning. Ruth Coleman died 2 weeks ago at 98, born in 1926. Her mother was Mary Coleman, née Johnson. Mary Johnson married Thomas Coleman in 1925. James leaned forward, understanding dawning. Ruth Coleman was their niece. Her mother's brother owned this farm. Exactly, which means Ruth's mother, Mary, would have known exactly what happened to her brother and his family. And she kept this photograph, passed it down to her daughter, who kept it hidden in a Bible for nearly a century. We need to find Ruth Coleman's descendants, James said firmly. Someone in that family knows the rest of this story. 3 days later, Marcus and James drove through the flat delta landscape of Mississippi, the spring air heavy with humidity and the smell of turned earth. Yazoo City appeared on the horizon, a small town that had changed remarkably little in appearance since the 1920s, though Marcus knew the surface calm hid generations of buried history. They had spent those 3 days researching Ruth Coleman's family tree. She had married young, had 3 children, and lived her entire life within 20 miles of where she was born. Her funeral had been held at Mount Olive Baptist Church, and the obituary listed 2 surviving children, a son named David Coleman, 71, and a daughter named Patricia Coleman Turner, 68. Marcus had called David Coleman the previous evening. The conversation had been brief and cautious. David had been surprised to hear that his mother's photograph had ended up at the National Archives. But when Marcus mentioned the Johnson family farm, there had been a long silence on the line. "You should come talk to my sister," David had finally said. "Patricia knows more about the old stories than I do. Mama talked to her about things she never told me." Now they pulled up to a neat brick house on the north side of town, where Patricia Coleman Turner lived with her husband. She was waiting on the porch, a tall woman with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that reminded Marcus immediately of the woman in the photograph, the mother holding the Bible. "Dr. Hayes? Professor Williams?" She stood and extended her hand. "Please, come in. I've been expecting someone to ask about that photograph for 70 years. Inside, her living room was filled with family pictures covering every wall and surface. Patricia offered them sweet tea and settled into an armchair, her hands folded in her lap. Marcus noticed they trembled slightly. My mother never spoke about her brother's family, Patricia began without preamble. She would say their names in her prayers every night, Samuel, Grace, and their children, but she wouldn't tell us what happened to them. She said it was too dangerous, that some stories had to stay buried until the people responsible were dead and gone. She paused, her eyes moving to a wooden box on the side table. When Mama passed 2 weeks ago, we found her Bible. That photograph was inside, along with something else. Letters, documents, things she'd kept hidden her entire life. Patricia lifted the wooden box and placed it on the coffee table between them. Mama made me promise, when I was a teenager and kept asking questions, that if anything happened to her, I should find someone who could tell the true story. Someone who would make sure people knew what happened to the Johnson family in the spring of 1927. She opened the box. Inside were envelopes, yellowed papers, and what appeared to be a journal bound in cracked leather. My Uncle Samuel kept records. Not just on the wall, he had a journal. He documented everything that was done to his family, every threat, every attempt to steal their land. And Mama's husband, my father, Thomas Coleman, he was there. He witnessed some of it. He helped Samuel hide this journal the night before. Her voice broke. James leaned forward gently. The night before what, Mrs. Turner? Patricia looked up, tears streaming down her face. The night before they came and burned the house down with the Johnson family inside. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. Marcus felt his throat constrict, while James closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of Patricia's words. She wiped her tears with a handkerchief and carefully lifted the leather journal from the box. My father told Mama what he saw, Patricia continued, her voice steadier now. Samuel Johnson bought that land in 1926 with money he'd saved for 15 years working on riverboats and doing construction work all over the South. He paid cash, $400, for 40 acres. The deed was legal and recorded. He was so proud. She opened the journal, handling the brittle pages with reverence. But the moment a black man owned good farmland in Yazoo County, certain people couldn't tolerate it. Samuel started this journal in March of 1927 when the threats began. Marcus leaned forward as Patricia began reading Samuel Johnson's own words, written in careful, educated script. March 11th, 1927. Mr. Robert Henderson came to the property line today. He owns the adjacent 300 acres. He offered me $200 for my land, half what I paid for it last year. When I politely declined, he said I should think carefully about my family's safety. Grace was frightened, but I told her we have every legal right to be here. March 15th, 1927. Found our dog dead near the well this morning. Poisoned. The children cried. This is meant to frighten us. I have written to the NAACP office in Memphis, asking for guidance. March 20th, 1927. 3 riders came last night, staying at the property line. They burned a cross in Henderson's field, where we could see it clearly. They want us to know what they are capable of. Thomas Coleman came over this morning. He and Mary are terrified for us. I told him we will not be driven from land we own legally. Patricia's voice wavered as she continued. March 28, 1927, received notice from the county tax assessor claiming my property taxes are delinquent, though I have receipts proving payment. This is a common tactic. They will try to take the land through false tax liens. I have contacted a lawyer in Jackson, Mr. William Davis, a colored attorney who has helped other families fight these schemes. April 2, 1927. Fire started in the south field last night. Thomas Coleman saw the smoke and came running with buckets. We managed to stop it from spreading to the house. I know it was set deliberately. I found kerosene cans at the edge of the field. Sheriff Briggs came this morning, but he seemed more interested in warning me to keep quiet and avoid trouble than in investigating who started the fire. James interrupted gently. Mrs. Turner, your father, Thomas Coleman, he was helping the Johnsons? He tried, Patricia said. Daddy was terrified, but Samuel was his wife's brother. Family meant everything. He couldn't just stand by and watch. Marcus noticed several loose papers tucked into the journal. What are those? Patricia carefully extracted them. Letters. One is from the NAACP attorney in Jackson. Another is from the county, threatening foreclosure. And this one, she held up a single page with handwriting different from Samuel's. This is from my grandmother, Grace Johnson. She wrote it the night before they died. She handed it to Marcus, who read aloud with a trembling voice. April 14th, 1927. If anyone finds this, know that we did not leave our land willingly. We did not abandon what we built. Samuel says they are coming tonight. Henderson told him this afternoon that tomorrow the land will be Henderson's, one way or another. We have sent the children to hide with Thomas and Mary. We are praying someone will protect them. Samuel and I will stay. This is our home. We will not run. Grace Johnson. Patricia closed the journal and folded her hands tightly in her lap. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, birds sang in the magnolia tree, oblivious to the weight of history being unearthed inside. My father never recovered from what he saw, Patricia said quietly. He was 22 years old that night. Mama, Mary, was 7 months pregnant with my oldest brother. They had taken Samuel and Grace's 3 children into their house that evening, hidden them in the back bedroom. Samuel and Grace insisted. They knew what was coming. She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the quiet street. Daddy told Mama the story only once, the night before he died in 1968. Mama made him tell it because she said the children, those 3 children who survived, deserved to know the truth about their parents. She wrote down everything he said, and I found those pages in her Bible. Patricia returned to her chair and pulled several handwritten pages from the wooden box. This is in Mama's handwriting, but these are Daddy's words. May I read it to you? Marcus and James nodded silently. Patricia began reading her mother's careful script. Thomas said that around midnight on April 14th, 1927, he heard the horses. At least a dozen men rode past his house toward Samuel's property, half a mile down the road. He wanted to go, wanted to help, but Mary begged him not to leave them. She had their own children and Samuel's 3 children in the house, and she was terrified the riders would come for them next. He watched from the darkness of his porch. He saw the torches. He heard the men shouting, telling Samuel and Grace to come out, to sign papers giving up the land. Samuel came to the door. Thomas could see him clearly in the torchlight. Samuel stood on his own porch and said loudly so everyone could hear, "This is my legal property. I have done nothing wrong. I will not surrender what is mine." Patricia's voice broke, but she continued. Thomas said Robert Henderson was leading the group. He recognized Sheriff Briggs there, too, and several other prominent men from town. Henderson shouted that Samuel had until dawn to sign the deed transfer. Samuel said no. He went back inside and locked the door. The men waited until about 3 in the morning. Then they surrounded the house and set it on fire from all sides at once. Thomas heard Grace screaming. He heard Samuel trying to break through a window. The men shot into the house, preventing them from escaping. Thomas wanted to run down there, but Mary held him back, sobbing, saying, "They'll kill you too, and then what happens to all these children?" Marcus felt sick. James had his head in his hands. The house burned until dawn, Patricia continued reading. When the sun came up, Thomas walked down to the property. The house was gone, just smoking timbers and ash. He found 2 bodies in what had been the bedroom, burned beyond recognition. Sheriff Briggs was already there, writing in a notebook. He looked up at Thomas and said, "Terrible accident. Kerosene lamp must have tipped over. You didn't see anything, did you, boy?" Thomas said no, sir. He didn't see anything, because he had 3 children hidden in his house who would be killed if he told the truth. The sheriff nodded and said, "Smart. You keep being smart and your family will be just fine." Patricia set down the pages, her hands shaking. Henderson took possession of the land within a week. The county ruled it an accidental fire. Samuel and Grace Johnson were buried in the colored cemetery with no marker. My parents raised those 3 children as their own, never telling anyone they were Samuel and Grace's children, because they were terrified someone would kill them too if the truth came out. Marcus's mind raced. The 3 children, what happened to them? Patricia smiled sadly. They grew up as Colemans, my mother's other children. They never knew the truth about their real parents until they were adults. One of them, the oldest boy, was my Uncle Junior. He died in Vietnam in 1967. The girl, Evelyn, moved to Chicago in the 50s. The youngest boy, Thomas Jr., became a teacher here in Mississippi. He passed away 5 years ago. "Did they have children?" James asked. "Oh, yes," Patricia said. "Grandchildren, too. The Johnson bloodline survived. But none of them knew about the farm, about what Samuel and Grace fought for and died protecting, until Mama finally told the story before she died." She looked at Marcus and James with fierce determination. "That's why I'm glad you came. That photograph, this journal, these letters, this is proof. Proof that my Uncle Samuel and Aunt Grace were murdered for refusing to give up land that was legally theirs. Proof that the law protected the murderers and erased the victims. And proof that, even in the face of terror, they stood their ground." Marcus and James spent the next 2 hours carefully examining every document in Patricia's wooden box. Alongside Samuel Johnson's journal and Grace's final letter, they found property deeds, receipts, tax records, and correspondence that painted a comprehensive picture of a family fighting desperately to maintain their legal rights against a system designed to destroy them. One document particularly caught Marcus's attention, a letter from attorney William Davison Jackson, dated April 10th, 1927, just 4 days before the fire. Marcus read it aloud. "Dear Mr. Johnson, I have reviewed the documents you sent regarding the tax assessment dispute. The county's claim that you owe back taxes is fraudulent. Your receipts clearly show payment in full. This is a common tactic used to dispossess Negro landowners through legal theft. I am prepared to file an injunction in circuit court, but I must warn you that pursuing this case will make you a target. Men have died for less in Mississippi. If you wish to proceed, I will stand with you, but please consider carefully whether the risk to your family is worth the fight. Whatever you decide, I remain your servant in the cause of justice. William Davis, Attorney at Law. James looked up from another document he was examining. Samuel Johnson wrote back to Davis on April 12th, 2 days before he died. Listen to this. Dear Mr. Davis, I thank you for your honest counsel regarding the dangers we face. My wife and I have discussed this matter at length and with much prayer. We have decided to proceed with the legal action. If we surrender our land to these thieves, what message does that send to every other Negro family trying to build something for themselves? At some point, someone must stand. Let it be us. Please file the injunction. Samuel Johnson. The room fell silent. Patricia wiped her eyes. My uncle was not just defending his own property. He was making a stand for everyone. Marcus nodded slowly, his mind assembling the pieces. That's why they killed him. The injunction would have exposed the county's fraudulent practices in court. It would have created a legal precedent. Samuel Johnson wasn't just refusing to be intimidated, he was threatening to tear down the entire system they used to steal black-owned land. James stood and began pacing, his professor's mind working through the implications. And William Davis, do we know what happened to him? Patricia reached into the box again and pulled out a newspaper clipping, yellowed and fragile. Mama kept this too. It's from the Jackson Daily News, dated June 1927. The headline read, Negro Attorney Dies in Automobile Accident. The brief article described how William Davis had been killed when his car ran off a bridge outside Jackson. Authorities ruled it an accident. 3 months after Samuel and Grace died, James said grimly. That's no coincidence. Marcus was taking careful photographs of each document with his camera, ensuring every page was preserved digitally. Mrs. Turner, with your permission, I'd like to take these documents back to the National Archives for professional preservation and authentication. We'll return the originals to you, but these need to be part of the historical record. That's exactly what Mama wanted, Patricia said. She told me before she died, make sure people know. Make sure this doesn't get buried again. She waited 97 years for someone to ask the right questions. James picked up the photograph again, studying the faces of Samuel and Grace Johnson with new understanding. They knew when this picture was taken. They knew they might die. That's why the photograph exists. It was documentation, just like the journal. Evidence of who they were and what they stood for. And the writing on the wall, Marcus added, visible through that open door. That wasn't accidental either. Samuel positioned the shot deliberately. He wanted anyone who looked closely enough to see that there was more to the story, that something was written in the shadows of their home. Patricia stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a framed photograph. She handed it to Marcus. It showed 3 elderly African-American individuals, 2 men and a woman, standing together at what appeared to be a family reunion, dated 1995. Those are Samuel and Grace's children, Patricia said softly. The ones who survived because my parents hid them. Junior, Evelyn, and Thomas, they lived full lives. They had children and grandchildren. The Johnson family survived, even though Samuel and Grace didn't. Marcus stared at the photograph, thinking about legacy and sacrifice. Samuel and Grace Johnson had died defending 40 acres of Mississippi farmland, and 97 years later, their descendants were living across America, most of them never knowing the price their ancestors had paid. How many Johnson descendants are there now? He asked. Patricia smiled. Last time we counted at the reunion, maybe 45, 50 people, spread out across the country, Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, Los Angeles, right here in Mississippi. Teachers, nurses, engineers, soldiers. My cousin Raymond is a doctor in Houston. His daughter just graduated from law school. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. Samuel and Grace died to protect land they never got to pass down. But they did pass something down. They passed down the knowledge that we have the right to stand our ground, that our dignity matters, that we don't have to accept injustice just because the system says we should. Every single one of their descendants carries that legacy, whether they know the story or not. Back in Washington a week later, Marcus sat in his office surrounded by authenticated documents, verified death certificates, property records, and historical newspaper archives. The National Archives conservation team had carefully preserved and digitized everything Patricia had shared. Now came the harder work, building an airtight historical case that could withstand scrutiny and tell the complete truth about what happened in Yazoo County in April 1927. James had returned to Mississippi with a research team from the university, armed with ground-penetrating radar and historical survey maps. They'd located the original Johnson property, now subdivided and developed, and were working to establish the exact location where the house had stood. Meanwhile, Marcus focused on tracing the web of complicity that enabled the murder. The property records told a clear story. On April 16th, 1927, just 2 days after the fire, Robert Henderson filed a claim on the Johnson land, citing unpaid debts Samuel supposedly owed him. With no living Johnsons to contest the claim and Sheriff Briggs signing off as a witness, the property transferred to Henderson for $50 in a private sale. Marcus discovered that Henderson had made similar acquisitions throughout 1927. Between January and June of that year, Henderson had obtained 8 different properties formerly owned by black families, all in Yazoo County, all through combinations of tax foreclosures, debt claims, and suspicious accidents. The pattern was unmistakable. Then Marcus found something that made him reach for the phone immediately. In the county courthouse records, buried in a routine probate filing from 1952, was Robert Henderson's will. Among the property distributions to his children was a notation: the South 40 acres, formerly the Johnson property, acquired April 1927. The will included an unusual clause that Marcus read 3 times to make certain he understood it. I direct that the circumstances of this acquisition not be investigated or questioned by my heirs. What was done was necessary for the prosperity of this county and should remain undisturbed. It was as close to a confession as Henderson would ever give. James called that evening from Mississippi. "Marcus, we found something. The house foundation is still there, buried under 2 feet of soil. We found metal fragments, bed frame parts, a stove, tools. We found something else. Bullets. 9 of them, embedded in what would have been the wooden walls. Samuel and Grace didn't just die in a fire, they were shot." Marcus closed his eyes, though he'd suspected as much. "That makes it murder, not manslaughter. Not an accident. Premeditated murder." "We're documenting everything," James continued. "We've also been interviewing elderly residents. We found a 94-year-old man, Ernest Watkins, whose grandfather worked for Henderson. Ernest remembers his grandfather coming home in April 1927, drunk and crying, saying Henderson had made him and others do something terrible and threatening to kill anyone who spoke about it. Can he go on record? He's willing. He says he's old enough now that he doesn't fear dead men's threats anymore. He wants the truth told before he dies." Over the following weeks, Marcus and James built their case methodically. They obtained autopsy records from the county coroner, perfunctory documents that listed cause of death as accidental fire without any actual examination of the bodies. They found records showing Sheriff Briggs had received a significant property donation from Henderson in May 1927, 1 month after the fire. They traced the 8 other black families who'd lost property to Henderson and discovered similar patterns of intimidation, violence, and theft. 3 of those families still had descendants in the area. 2 were willing to talk. One elderly woman, Louise Washington, showed James a photograph of her grandfather standing in front of his general store in 1926. "Henderson wanted to buy it," she said. "Granddaddy said no. The store burned down 3 months later. Henderson bought the land at tax auction for almost nothing. Nobody ever said it wasn't an accident, but everybody knew." Marcus compiled everything into a comprehensive report: the murder of Samuel and Grace Johnson and the systematic dispossession of black landowners in Yazoo County, Mississippi, 1926-1930. The document was 53 pages long, with 72 citations and authenticated primary sources. It told not just the story of one family, but of an entire community terrorized and robbed of their property, their wealth, and in some cases, their lives. The question now was what to do with this information. The murders happened 97 years ago. Everyone directly responsible was long dead. But the theft remained. The land Samuel and Grace died defending was still owned by Henderson's descendants. The injustice was historical, but its effects rippled forward into the present. Marcus stood before a packed auditorium at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington. Patricia Coleman Turner sat in the front row, flanked by 17 members of the Johnson family who had traveled from across the country for this moment. News media filled the back rows. Word had spread about the discovery. Behind Marcus, projected on a massive screen, was the photograph that started everything. Samuel, Grace, and their 3 children standing proudly on their land in April 1927, with the faint writing visible through the doorway of their home. "History tells us that the past is past," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. "That what happened generations ago is tragic, but cannot be changed, and therefore should be left buried. But this photograph proves otherwise. This image shows us that the dead speak, if we're willing to listen, that evidence survives if we're willing to look, and that justice delayed is not the same as justice denied." He clicked to the next slide, Samuel Johnson's journal entries, his careful documentation of threats and violence. Samuel Johnson was a methodical man. He understood that in 1927 Mississippi, a black man's word would never be taken over a white man's. So he created evidence. He documented everything. He wrote it in his journal, he wrote it on his walls, and he made sure this photograph captured a glimpse of that documentation. Click. The death certificate, listing accidental fire. Then the property transfer to Henderson, dated 2 days later. Then the will, with its telling clause about not investigating the acquisition. What we have here is not just a tragedy, it's a crime. Samuel and Grace Johnson were murdered because they refused to surrender property they legally owned. They were shot and burned alive, and their deaths were covered up by county officials who profited from the theft of their land. This was not an isolated incident. This was part of a systematic campaign of terror and theft that stripped African American families of an estimated $16 billion in land wealth across the South between 1910 and 1960. Patricia was crying quietly in the front row, holding hands with a younger woman, Evelyn's daughter, Grace's granddaughter, named after the grandmother she'd never known. Marcus clicked to the next slide, a map showing the current status of the original Johnson property. Today, that 40 acres Samuel and Grace died for is worth approximately $2 million. It was subdivided in 1985 and developed into a shopping center. The current owners are the grandchildren of Robert Henderson. They inherited wealth built on murder and theft. He paused, letting that sink in. The question before us now is, what does justice look like 97 years later? We cannot bring Samuel and Grace back. We cannot undo the trauma inflicted on their children or the descendants who grew up never knowing this history. But we can do three things. First, we can tell the truth. This report will be published and made freely available. The full story of what happened in Yazoo County will enter the historical record. Schools will teach it. Museums will display it. The Johnson family will finally be recognized as what they were. Heroes who stood against injustice at the cost of their own lives. Second, we can demand accountability from institutions. The Yazoo County government participated in this crime. The sheriff's department, the tax assessor's office, the county courts, they were all complicit. Those institutions still exist. They owe the Johnson family and the other dispossessed families an official apology and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And third, we can pursue restitution. Not revenge, but restoration. The Johnson descendants have legal standing to pursue claims against the current property holders and against Yazoo County itself. This is not about punishing people for their ancestors' crimes. It's about restoring what was stolen and acknowledging that theft has consequences that echo through generations. The room erupted in applause. Patricia stood, tears streaming down her face, and the 17 other Johnson family members stood with her. Marcus saw in their faces something he'd been searching for throughout this entire investigation. Recognition. The knowledge that their family's story mattered, that their ancestors' courage meant something, that the silence had finally been broken. After the presentation, a young woman approached Marcus. She introduced herself as Rachel Johnson Harris, Evelyn's great-granddaughter, a civil rights attorney in Atlanta. Dr. Hayes, my family wants to pursue this legally. We want to file suit for the return of the property value. Will you testify? Marcus didn't hesitate. Yes, absolutely. 18 months after Marcus first examined the photograph, he stood on a crisp October morning in Yazoo County, Mississippi, surrounded by more than 200 people. The crowd included Johnson family descendants, historians, reporters, civil rights activists, and local residents, both black and white, who had come to witness this moment. The Yazoo County Board of Supervisors had voted unanimously, after months of pressure and national attention, to issue a formal apology for the county's role in the murder of Samuel and Grace Johnson and the systematic dispossession of black landowners. The legal battle over property restitution was still ongoing, but this ceremony represented something equally important: official acknowledgement of the truth. A new historical marker stood ready to be unveiled, placed on the exact location where the Johnson house had stood. Marcus had helped write the text, working closely with Patricia and the Johnson family to ensure the words honored Samuel and Grace properly. Patricia stepped forward to speak, her voice strong despite her 70 years. My mama kept this secret for 97 years because she was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if people knew the truth. Afraid that speaking out would put her family in danger. She lived her whole life carrying that fear, and it broke my heart that she died without seeing this moment. She paused, looking around at the assembled crowd. But she did see something. She saw her brother's children grow up safe. She saw them have children of their own. She saw the Johnson family survive and thrive, despite everything that was done to destroy us. And before she died, she made sure the evidence survived so that one day, someone would finally tell the truth. The county supervisor, a black woman named Angela Roberts, approached the marker. On behalf of Yazoo County, I acknowledge the grave injustice committed against Samuel and Grace Johnson and their children. I acknowledge that county officials participated in murder, theft, and the cover-up of both. I acknowledge that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic campaign to deny African American citizens their constitutional rights to own property and live in peace. She pulled the cord and the covering fell away. The marker read, Johnson Family Farm, established in 1926. On this site stood the home of Samuel and Grace Johnson, who purchased 40 acres of farmland through their own labor and savings. When they refused to surrender their legal property to local white landowners, they were murdered in April 1927, and their deaths were falsely ruled accidental. Their 3 children survived. Samuel and Grace Johnson died defending the principle that all Americans have the right to own property and live free from terror. Their courage and sacrifice honor all those who resisted injustice during the Jim Crow era. Let their names be remembered. The crowd was silent for a long moment, then someone began singing. Marcus recognized the song, "We Shall Overcome." More voices joined, old and young, black and white, until the field rang with the sound. James stood beside Marcus. Both men moved beyond words. "You did it," James said quietly. "You brought them home." Marcus shook his head. "Samuel and Grace did it. They left the evidence. They made sure someone would eventually see. We just listened." After the ceremony, Marcus walked the property boundaries with a group of Johnson descendants. Rachel Johnson Harris was there, along with her father, and Samuel's great-great-grandchildren, teenagers who were learning this history for the first time. One young man, about 16, asked Marcus, "Do you think it was worth it, what they did? They could have just left, stayed alive, raised their kids?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Samuel and Grace made a choice that I hope none of us ever have to make. They decided that some principles matter more than safety, that standing up for what's right, even when the cost is everything, is worth it. Not because they wanted to die, they desperately wanted to live, but because they understood that if everyone always chooses safety over justice, injustice wins forever." The young man nodded slowly, staring at the marker. "They were brave." "They were," Marcus agreed. "And so was your ancestor who preserved this story. And so are all of you for demanding the truth be told." 3 months later, the legal case reached a settlement. The Henderson family descendants agreed to pay $1.8 million to the Johnson family descendants, not full restitution for the current property value, but a significant acknowledgement of responsibility. The money would be placed in a trust, funding scholarships for Johnson family descendants and supporting black landowner rights organizations across the South. More importantly, the case established legal precedent. Other families who had lost land to theft and violence began coming forward with their own evidence. Marcus and James found themselves advising on dozens of similar cases across Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana. The silence that had protected decades of theft was finally breaking. On a warm spring evening, Marcus received a package at his office. Inside was a letter from Patricia Coleman Turner and a small wooden frame containing the original photograph of Samuel, Grace, and their children. Patricia's letter read, "Dr. Hayes, my mama would want you to have this. You gave Samuel and Grace their voices back. You made sure the world knows they existed, that they mattered, that they stood for something. This photograph isn't just about death and injustice anymore. Now, when people look at it, they see courage, they see resistance, they see a family that refused to surrender their dignity. Thank you for seeing what was written in the shadows. Thank you for listening to the dead. With gratitude and love, Patricia." Now, Marcus hung the photograph in his office, positioned so the light caught it just right, so anyone who looked carefully could see through that open doorway to the words written on the wall inside. Students and colleagues who visited would ask about it, and Marcus would tell them the story of Samuel and Grace Johnson, who documented their own oppression, who created evidence with the hope that someday someone would care enough to look. The photograph that seemed joyful at first glance, that image of a proud family on their own land, now told its complete truth. Yes, there was joy in that moment, but there was also defiance, courage, and a deliberate act of bearing witness. Samuel and Grace Johnson knew they might not survive, but they made sure their story would. And 97 years later, it finally did.